just ABR, always be recording. But yeah, I mean, I think this, this issue that's come up in the news recently with Northwestern and the football coach and the baseball coach being let go very close together. It's obviously we can sit here and we can talk about the details of those specific cases, but I think you guys know as well as I do that this isn't anything new. Hazing has been around, I think, as long as sport has been around. And I was just thinking about what is the common denominator between like hazing, emotional, physical, sexual abuse from coaches. And to me, it just comes down to these power differences between athletes and coaches and athletes and other athletes. And then you throw in that kind of in-group, out-group dynamic that's present in sports. You're either in our group or you're not. And it feels like a petri dish for doing some pretty amazing things as a team, but also for these situations where I guess power just kind of gets the better of people individually and the culture, as we can see, based on what's been happening at Northwestern. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of kick off a discussion with that thought about power dynamics, and maybe sports aren't so unique in that, because we see that in a lot of other places in society in general. But yeah, what are your guys' thoughts?
Well, I think it's like, I mean, I agree about like the risk of enabling someone with that kind of power, right? Unchecked power is really what we're talking about. It's like it reminds me of there was a keynote talk at the ASP conference a few years ago. John Amici, former basketball player, became a psychologist. He was talking about his experience, and one of the things he said, which felt pretty provocative at the time, was like, coaches are essentially like, we give coaches access to the most vulnerable populations with virtually no safeguards, no training, no credentials required. Like, basically, if you were good at the sport, you can be a coach. And I mean, I have coached. I've coached on a number of teams. I've coached high school students. I've coached college students. None of those teams, I checked references. None of those teams did a background check. I coached for the university where I went to graduate school, where Keith and I both went to graduate school, Catholic University. I became the head coach of that team, never talking to any staff person at the university. The team hired me. The athletes hired me. Completely unchecked power, right? And then you look at these universities, I mean, these examples at Northwestern, right? The baseball coach, and I know he was only there for like a season or something like that, but he had previously been at West Point and led them to 4 consecutive championships. So it's like, if you're winning, we're just going to look the other way. It's like, this is the cost. This is the cost of greatness, right? This is the price of winning, which just seems ridiculous to me.
I do think we want to be a little bit careful about, obviously your experience was your experience with how you got hired. I do think there are plenty of programs or clubs that do more diligence than that. So I want to make sure we don't paint with too broad of a brush. And there's certainly sports. One that just jumps into my mind is soccer, where, there are credentials that you need in order to be a coach, right? It's not just being good at the sport. But I think something that I will wholeheartedly agree with, and that's been well documented, and many coaches that I've spoken with have addressed this too, is how little attention is given to mental health factors or to mental training, or some of the more sort of interpersonal dynamics that are part of being a coach. So I was at that John Amici talk as well, and I don't remember the exact context. It was a handful of years ago now, but as you just brought that up, Tim, I do remember the idea, like you mentioned, like with vulnerable populations, that a lot of these coaches just aren't taught how to relate or how to be sensitive to those kinds of issues necessarily. They may be masters of their sport. They may know the X's and O's. They may know how to teach or how to communicate to some extent, but they may not get background checked, so to speak, in terms of how do they treat other people? How do they relate to other people? What is their skill set there? I wish that there was more structure in place. I mean, even, I guess I'll pose this to you guys too. You've both been coaches in university settings. Taylor, you're a coach now in university setting. That's not a position that I've had. I've always been on the psychology side. I've never, certainly as a psychologist, been asked, hey, can you, on behalf of the university, or behalf of the organization, talk to this person and see what you think of him as a leader or what his personality style is. We're thinking of hiring him. Like, I'd be curious how standard of practice that is, that someone would be brought in like that to due diligence that way. I've never heard of that happening.
I've never heard of that happening.
Yeah, I certainly haven't heard of it happening either. I think, getting hired at the current university I'm at, I certainly did have a background check. And I did also have I don't know what they called it. But every coach now in the country, at least in rowing, has to go through the Safe Sport certification. And it's somewhere between a 30-minute and a 90-minute course on basically how to be a good, appropriate person. And athletes actually, I think most clubs now go through a Safe Sport course that essentially helps them identify coaches who are not adhering to Safe Sport. So it's kind of a little bit more of a triangulated approach. And there are even I think a lot of clubs even require any athlete in the club who's over 18 has to go through a Safe Sport training. So it's not just the coaches, it's even if you're a master's rower who's 50, you have to go through Safe Sport training if you're in a club that has minors rowing in it. Now, I think Safe Sport is really in its infancy in terms of how they operate and how they get things done. I guess it was Keith, you shared the article recently on Conal Groom, who has been.
It was Tim, actually.
Tim, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Tim, you shared that. And for the listeners, this is a former Olympic rower, many accolades as a coach, but was just verbally, physically, and sexually abusive to a lot of his athletes, or certainly a number of his athletes. And Safe Sport, really the body that was supposed to be protecting these athletes, and U.S. rowing, it based on the way the article portrayed, it really seemed to drag their feet on doing anything about it substantially. And I did a little Googling yesterday, and it really seems like even on this, there's a Safe Sport directory kind of list of the people who have violated the rules, and there it still says temporary suspension. It doesn't say that he's even completely out of the game, and he actually might be coaching somewhere right now. I'm not even sure. So I think we still have a long way to go on those systems and checks and balances even working correctly. And it seems pretty ridiculous to say, but it's certainly not perfect, though. I think there's been moves in the right direction. It's not anywhere near where it needs to be. And
I mean, I'm glad you brought up Safe Sport, because I think I was thinking a lot about that too. I've encountered Safe Sport. I'm in the directory of clinical providers for the USOC. And we, as even a provider, we have to be very aware of Safe Sport and certified ourselves, and then also understand like how to file complaints and if an athlete reports something like that. And I absolutely applaud an organization like that in their purpose. but having gone through this safe sport training just about every year, and having been around college athletes and seen, I know one of the articles that we looked at for the Northwestern situation talked about like they have to go through a training like at the start of the year on abuse and sexual assault and those kinds of things. It's pretty standard. Kind of tying this to what you started with, Taylor, when I think about the education that's out there and how that's approached and how that is able to compete, or better yet, not compete with the power dynamics, or kind of the traditions too. I think that's another aspect of this, of hazing and some of these practices, is that things get passed down from one generation to the next, and not necessarily like a generation like father to son, generation like freshman to senior, right? And it was done to me, so I'm going to do it to you, kind of thing, which I think is all over sport in terms of coaching philosophy to, unfortunate practices like this, that there are many ways in which sport can be regressive, because it's just, I'm just going to always do what was done to me. And so when you combine like these power dynamics and the motivation to wield that power with the sort of entrenched systems that exist, and you compare that to the education, where it's essentially like I'm watching a pretty cheesy video, or I'm hearing a sort of not super engaging talk necessarily on appropriate behavior. At least in my experience of the things, people don't take those educational pieces super seriously, and it certainly doesn't threaten the systems that perpetuate this kind of really toxic and unfortunate behavior that we're talking about today. So I agree with you 100% that we're not where we need to be in terms of policing this and education.
Yeah, because I mean, in theory, right? Like safe sport it is a very important and a very good idea, but right in practice, to put it in, because part of it is putting it on the athlete, right? So all the athletes can go through this training so that they can identify when there's an abusive coach. But in that Connell Groom article, like one of the athletes even said, like, it was because I watched a safe sport video, because we made it to this championship and we had to all watch it, where I was like, oh, wait a second, that's abuse. What he's doing to me is abuse, but no one else is saying anything. Can I be the one to say anything? Like to say like that athlete should go ahead and file a complaint. And then in that specific example, like, I think it was, I can't remember if it was safe sport or US rowing, but one of the athletes who did file a complaint talked about their experience of being followed up. They're like, hey, can you go on record and actually like, testify or whatever it would be, I guess, against this coach? And the athlete was like, this person's still coaching me. Like, I'm trying to make the Olympic team. I'm not gonna put my neck out, because this is making this team is really important to me. It's like, it's the idea, is there, but to think that the athletes themselves, or even an assistant coach who's watching a head coach who may be kind of like just this kind of bigger than life figure, right? To say that, oh, you are the people that need to speak up, like that to me does not seem like a workable system.
Yeah. I kind of moving on what you said, Keith, like what will move the needle on this? I think more on the you've heard about this a lot in rowing as well, and I know we keep using rowing, but you can use a lot of sports of kind of the um like archetype of the tough coach who's really really hard on their athletes, and might take things a little far sometimes, and people kind of look at that and say, oh, that coach is just really tough, or that coach is that's just the way that coach is, that's how they get the best out of their athletes. And even speaking to athletes, sometimes they kind of look at something that might actually be physical or emotional abuse as a method to kind of push them or take them to the next level in some way. And you might even hear some coaches nowadays saying, well, if you're not hard on athletes, they'll just be soft. They won't ever be tough. And so I really think it's going to take a big paradigm shift of um, how do you build toughness in athletes? How do you bring athletes to the next level? How do you make them really gritty? How do you make them not want to quit and go as hard as they possibly can, or even push their limits without being really, really kind of tough? And I think that's the fear that a lot of coaches have, is like, my athletes are just gonna be soft if I'm not like really, really tough on them. So
I think what you're speaking to, I mean, there's a lot that you just spoke to. So I don't want to disregard, because there's a lot of different pieces to it. But the last part in particular, I mean, this is a big thing that we talk about in our MSPE Institute work all the time. Is this culture of fear, and how that culture of fear motivates, how athletes motivate themselves, and also how coaches tend to motivate athletes, and how that, I guess you could say, works to an extent, in terms of some of the things you were saying, Taylor, in terms of trying to push or trying to inspire. But it's a deeply flawed system. An inefficient system is the way I often refer to it. There's a high risk of burnout. Kind of makes you feel crappy. And certainly it takes a whole lot of energy then to fight the fear, rather than really just sort of what our natural motivational system is, which is intrinsic motivation, right? I mean, if you look at, and this might sound a little bit hokey, but it's really the truth, and I think it's backed up by the science. Like, if you look at kids, you look at what makes us good at sport to begin with. It's not because a kid is going out and saying, "Oh my God, I have to dribble the basketball today 1,000 times, or else I'm gonna suck," or all this sort of pressure. It's like, I'm gonna go outside and play with my friends because it's a fun thing to do. That's what kind of gets us started in sports. That is naturally inspiring. That's why we start to practice. That's why we start to train. And it seems like at some point, I mean, my sort of anecdotal number that I've identified is like around 12 or 13 for a lot of youth athletes, is something switches. It's like, oh no, now I'm serious. And once the athlete becomes serious, now I've got to switch to this other system that's based on fear, that's based on incentive, that's based on power. And I think coaches both kind of create that and perpetuate that, right? A lot of this is coming from the adults in the kids' lives, parents and coaches. And then that just goes on through high school. It goes on through college. It goes all the way up through into the professional ranks. I guess I am somewhat encouraged that it does feel like there's been a little bit of a needle move in terms of this next generation of athletes that's coming up now, that it feels like there has been a shift between what we might refer to as like the old guard and some of the younger athletes and coaches that are out there. Certainly not to say that there isn't still a lot of problem behavior. And I don't think, there's ever a case in which some of the cases that we're talking about today would ever be acceptable. But I think, going back to what originally you were saying, Taylor, the question, like, what moves the needle? I think the more cases like this that get busted wide open, like what happened at Northwestern or what happened with this rowing coach, and people realize, oh, this isn't okay. Oh, this traditionally closed off system where coaches had this unchecked power, when we shine a spotlight on there and say, this is messed up. And oh, by the way, there's plenty of coaches who don't do it this way and are wildly successful. It starts to question this system that for so many decades just was never questioned. And I would hope that folks like Tim and I, and like you, Taylor, who are doing the work that we're doing in sports science, in sports psychology, who are trying to provide this education and awareness that, hey, actually intrinsic motivation is a more efficient fuel than fear. And this is how you can teach athletes, whether they're young all the way up through professional athletes, how to use that kind of motivation to get the best out of themselves. Like, the more people that listen to us, the more people who are banging that drum, I think hopefully that's what makes change sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Yeah, because when you brought in like that, just thinking about the way that kind of kids relate to sport, I mean, I was thinking about that too. Or thinking about some of like the educational literature about the ways that children really respond to expectations, right? And if you have low expectations for kids, they will meet those low expectations. And if you have higher expectations for kids, they will tend to perform to that expectation, and as so many things, I mean, it really feels like rooted in the fear of losing control. because there's so much trust required in letting an athlete be driven by intrinsic motivation. That like, okay, I'm gonna empower you. I'm the coach, you're the athlete. I'm gonna empower you, the athlete, to like take good care of yourself, right? Which might mean, you get to choose when you take a day off. And actually, one of the coaches I was working with last year, she instituted this policy with her team. Definitely in the last season, perhaps in the last two, where she was like, everyone gets 3, like no questions asked. Like, if you just can't do it today, you can't do it today. And she said, there was an initial fear of like, oh man, will all the athletes just like take advantage of this, use the first 3 in the first 3 days, like, will they use it to skip the most important workouts? And that wasn't what happened at all. Like, she found that, wow, I can really trust them to like know what they need and to like pull back when they need to and to lean in when they need to. And guess what? They won their championship this year. There's like, so I think if you've got a coach who's really expecting you to slack off and expecting you to be soft if you don't get punished, like, I think that has this insidious way of getting internalized. And so, yeah, I think an athlete will kind of just become part of that culture. But if you say, I absolutely expect you to be internally motivated, I expect you to be self-driven, and I trust that you will show up for me and the rest of the team, like, it really does seem like athletes can rise to that expectation too.
Yeah, I was just talking to an athlete today that I'm recruiting, and yeah, he really asked what was one thing that attracted me to the team that I coach for now, and I started talking about the head coach's approach to coaching. And after I was done kind of describing it, the athlete kind of said, well, it kind of sounds a little bit like you guys are just a little bit like low key, kind of relaxed. And I said, no, I don't think that's it, really. I think what we really are, what the head coach really perpetuates, is kind of what we're talking about here. It's like it's a real respect, and it's a real trust for the athletes. And I think sometimes coaches, they get put up onto this pedestal, this ivory tower, and they kind of expect the athletes to have that fear, Keith, like that almost worshiping in a way of this like larger than life figure of this coach, and they never question them, and they're always worried about the coach getting angry and punishing them, and I've seen that time and time again, and it's been such a breath of fresh air to coach for somebody who I genuinely feel like the athletes don't fear. The athletes feel like this is, clearly he's the coach, he's in charge, but it's almost, you hear about organizations in corporate cultures. Certain organizations are horizontal, organizations versus hierarchical. And, that was one of the first words that the coach used when he was hiring me, was that, we're very horizontal here. And it's really true. It's almost like he's an older, more experienced rower who just doesn't really row much anymore, and more coaches. And it's so interesting the way that happens, and the success it brings, and the openness on the team it brings. And so I think it's, just to kind of wrap this up, if you guys were to both give a first step for a coach who's listening to this right now, that goes, okay, I love this in philosophy, but like, what does this look like? How do I go from where I am now to where I want to be? How do I get from a fear-based culture to a more trust-based culture?
I mean, I would say I'm glad you phrased it that way, because I was hoping to make this point before we stop this conversation today. Follow the science. Follow the science. I mean, I said earlier, one of the things that's so frustrating about sport, as much as I love what I do and love working in sport, is that it's so darn stubborn, right? I'm just going to do what my mentor did, or I'm just going to do to the underclassmen what happened to me when I was an underclassman. And that is not very scientific in terms of what gets the best out of people. If we can agree that winning is important, that culture is important, that, I ultimately want to be successful and keep my job, to kind of step back and be able to look at, well, what am I doing? You know, how am I approaching this? Is this actually getting the best out of my athletes? Is this getting the best out of me? You know, and whenever I think about this, the one idea that always jumps out to me is self-determination theory, which is kind of the gold standard now in human motivation, right? Like one of the creators of self-determination theory literally wrote the book that's called Why We Do What We Do, like literally understanding human motivation. And the three key ingredients to this sort of best form of motivation that we've got, this intrinsic motivation that we're talking about today, right, are a sense of autonomy, meaning a sense of independence, what Tim just talked about, a sense of competence, right? Like, which, I mean, every athlete who reaches out to me wants to feel more confident. They want to believe in themselves more. They want to feel better about themselves. Well, yeah, competence is right there. I need to feel like I know what I'm doing. And a sense of relatedness, right? A sense of connection to the people around me, to my sport itself, right? And if you think about the behaviors we're talking about, I mean, certainly, and I always, when having these kinds of conversations, want to put things in perspective, right? I mean, there's degrees. There's horrific abusive behavior, which is in a different category from fear, you know, just more standard fear-based practices. I think that distinction needs to be made. But even the standard fear-based practices violate all three of those self-determination principles in terms of what gets the best out of somebody. So for any coach who's listening, for anybody who really wants to win, really wants to be successful, really want to see what true human potential can be, follow the science. Don't follow what's always been done just because that's what's been done.
I agree with all of that. And I feel like what does a coach actually do with that? I mean, like the science is there, and it's also common sense, right? Like healthy athletes are going to perform better. Like it just makes sense. I mean, the kind of general mindfulness principle of like, look to your own experience. When are you the coach? Like when am I my best self? Right? It's when I feel balanced, when I feel happy, when I feel well taken care of, like when I am healthy, that's when I perform the best in my individual identities, you know? And so a fundamental kind of shift that I encourage, not just coaches, I mean, I think people across the board, when you're interacting with something and you perceive that someone does something wrong, I think our gut is, or like our default is to ask, well, what's wrong with them? And I would say, you know, pause there and instead change that question to, what does that person need? I feel like if a coach could just make that baseline shift when they're interacting with their athletes, they see something is not working right with this athlete, the training's not going well, they're not doing what I need them to do. It's not what's wrong with them, it's what do they need. Like I think if we just start there, it could really change things.
Yeah, I hear servant leadership all over that, Tim. That was great.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
I'm talking to an athlete shortly after we get off this call, and I just wrote that down and underlined it to remind him, like, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, how often do we just forget to ask that basic?
Right. All right, guys. I think there's a lot of good stuff here.
Yeah.
You know, I think
it's fun.
We love you, Safe Sport. Don't hate us. We do love what you're about. Yes. We just
we like more. We need more of it. That's the point, right? It's like, yes, good start, like more.
Right. Yeah. Yes. It's the old yes and, right?